Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but people are worried about food shortages, mostly due to supply chain interruptions. But for whatever the reason, folks are stocking up on some food. And home canning is one of the primary ways to do that. So with that in mind, I am canning up some stuff to have on the shelf. And I thought I would share a couple of canning recipes with you. So I'm going to start with sausage bean soup in beef broth. This is from National Center for Home Food Preservation's website. Their soup recipe that allows you to make up your own soup within certain guidelines. And warning, 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 I'm going to talk a lot in this video. I'm going to talk about food safety, and I'm going to talk about Tattler lids, but mostly I'm going to talk about how to figure out how to use this recipe, because a lot of people tell me that it's kind of difficult to follow, that it's not very clear in its explanations, so I want to clarify that a little bit for you. Before we get started, if you will, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Makes us feel good. Thank you. So in order to use this recipe, and I'll put a link in the info section to this recipe, you have to do a few simple calculations. You need to figure out how much food you need to get 2 cups per quart jar of solids, and then you'll have 2 cups per quart jar of a liquid of some kind. I'm using beef broth. The basis of this recipe is beans. Dry beans need to be fully rehydrated, and it's a little hard to figure those because they don't measure the same now as they will after they're rehydrated. But we know that it takes 5 pounds of dry beans to make 7 quarts of rehydrated beans. So we only want 1 cup of beans per quart. So that's going to work out to 1 1/4 pounds of dry beans. And I'm going to put that calculation in the info section also. So we're starting with the beans and measuring out 1 pound 4 ounces. And then I will look over them and pull out any bad beans and wash them. And then I will show you how to rehydrate them to use in soup. So once they're washed, you're going to put them in a pan and cover them with water. You can estimate that, but you want about 3 cups of water per cup of beans. I don't measure, but you can. And this pot is way too big for the small amount of beans we have, but I'm going to use the same pot to make the soup in. This is an 8-quart pot. We're going to make 7 quarts of soup. No need to use a second pot. We're going to have plenty to wash now. So I basically bring the water to a boil first and then add the beans, only because I think it's a little bit quicker. But you can just put the beans in the water and bring the whole thing to a boil. And then we're going to boil these for 2 minutes. Once they come up to a boil, I will put the lid on and set my timer for 2 minutes. After the 2-minute boil, I'm going to just turn the heat off, keep them covered, and let them soak for an hour. And let me mention right here, I'm using pinto beans. You can use your favorite beans, black beans. You could use peas. So while the beans are soaking, I'm going to cook the sausage. And this is just 2 pounds of bulk sausage. Now for this recipe, or for any meat canning, this needs to be ground sausage, fresh sausage. It can't be any kind of cured meat. It can't be ham, can't be smoked sausage, can't be wieners. It has to be fresh meat. This particular recipe calls for cooked meat. So you could use your leftover turkey, you could use some chicken, you could use ground beef. It just can't be anything that's cured. And if you're using poultry, it can't be like raw ground chicken or turkey. It could be turkey that you've already cooked. It could be chicken you've already cooked, but not ground raw poultry of any kind. So I'm going to break this up while it's cooking. I don't want it to be too broken up. I want to have some sausage chunks. That's to your preference. Just don't overcook it. You don't want to make it hard. And I did a little time lapse there. So now I'm going to take this up and put it into a colander, because I want to drain it and rinse as much of the fat off as I can. Won't be able to get all the fat, but as much as you can. And to do that, I actually put it here in the sink and I rinse it with hot water. And you know, I actually hear Fred's voice in my ear. If you don't know Fred, that's my late husband. He's in some of my earlier videos. And in my head, I hear Fred saying, "Don't pour the grease down the drain." And he's right. I shouldn't have. You shouldn't. Do as I say, not as I do. So now we're going to do some more calculation. We weighed our beans, but everything else is going to be done by volume. And I'm going to pack this measuring cup with the cooked sausage to determine the finished volume. So bear with me now. This is why. Because we fill our quart jars half full, that's 2 cups per jar. That's 14 cups total solids for this recipe. By our calculations, we should have 7 cups of beans when we're finished. That may vary because beans vary, but that's going to be pretty close. So I need 7 more cups to make up the needed volume. I'm going to measure the meat. I started with 2 pounds of sausage, but the fat cooked out, so I don't know what the volume will be, so I have to measure it. And when I pack this sausage in, I have pretty nearly 4 cups of cooked meat. And you do want to pack it in because you want to get you don't want to be measuring air. So with 4 cups of meat, that means I need 3 more cups of something. And I'll show you what that something is here shortly. So at this point, I'm going to put the meat in the refrigerator. I'm going to cover it because I don't want it to sit out while I do the rest of my preparations. Now back to the beans. The beans boiled 2 minutes. They set in that hot water for an hour. And now we're going to rinse them off. So I'm just going to pour them into a colander here and rinse them in some cool water. Now, you know, at this point you may be wondering, well, why don't I just use some previously canned beans and save myself a lot of trouble? So now just let me rain on your parade. You cannot use previously canned beans. The steps in this recipe are tested, and you need to follow the recipe the way it's written, because that's how you're sure when you're done the product in your jar is safe. Your previously canned beans are already cooked. When I get all of this together, it's going to be cooking in jars under pressure for an hour and 15 minutes. You need to start with the beans at the proper stage of rehydration. And while we're talking about that, you can't substitute frozen vegetables. You can't substitute previously canned vegetables. You start with fresh vegetables. And they should be prepared as if you were going to hot pack can them. So now these beans have been drained and rinsed, and I've put them back in my 8-quart pot, and I'm going to cover them with fresh water, bring them to a boil, and boil them for another 30 minutes. And that will bring them to the stage where they can be used to can in my soup. Once they've cooked that additional 30 minutes, I'm going to drain and rinse them again. We're not going to use this water in our soup. We're going to use beef broth, which, by the way, you may use commercially canned broth in this recipe. Now, when I get these drained, I'm going to put them in a bowl and put them in the refrigerator. And if you need to split up this recipe over 2 days, this is the point at which you refrigerate the meat and the beans, and you can pick up fresh in the morning. Or you can just go forward from here. I'll see you in the morning. And well, good morning. Welcome back to Debbie's Back Porch. Into my 8-quart pot, I have measured 14 cups of beef broth. And this is a mixture of commercially canned beef broth and home canned beef broth. If you want to use commercially canned beef broth, you're going to want to use fat-free and look for broth that has no additives, no preservatives, which means you're probably going to have to buy organic broth. Now I need to give you a note here. You know how when you're canning a recipe from the Ball book or from the National Center, and it says you should get 8 pints and you end up getting 12 or 6. Break, I'm adding a tablespoonful of salt. Anyway, figuring the yield can be kind of difficult because like beans don't always rehydrate the same way depending on the age of the beans. I tell you that because 14 cups of broth should have been exactly enough, but in reality it was 1 quart short. So when I started jarring this up, I added a quart more broth. That is a tablespoonful of garlic powder. You can add any dry ground spices to this mixture that you like, not fresh herbs, not dried herbs, dry ground spices. And I'm going to add a teaspoonful of chili powder to this just to give it a little bit of kick. You know, it looks like my garlic is lumped up there. I'm going to have to stir that up. So the chili powder will give it just a tiny bit of tang. You want to always go lightly on your dry ground spices because canning can intensify the taste. So when you spread it out over 7 quarts, this is a very light hand with the spices, and that's intentional. I've got to break up that garlic. So now my broth is hot. Let's go ahead and put all of our parts together. I'm going to add the beans. Then I'll add the meat, and I'll explain now. I have 3 cups of vegetables that I'm going to add to this soup to make up the 7 cups of solids that we need added together with the sausage. I hope that makes sense. We had 4 cups of sausage by volume, so I need 3 more cups of solids for the mixture. I'm going to do that in vegetables. I'm going to have 2 cups of carrots prepared for canning as if I were going to do a hot pack. And then I'm going to have 1 cup of a mixture of minced onions, and diced celery. Now, neither onions nor celery have separate canning directions, so you would think you couldn't use those in these recipes. But because so many soup recipes require onions and celery, there goes my carrots, I contacted National Center for Home Food Preservation. See, this is my onions and celery. And I asked specifically about onions and celery and was directed that as long as they were cleaned and diced and blanched for 5 minutes before canning, they were safe to use. So I'm cooking them for 5 minutes in with the rest of the soup, and then it will be ready for canning. So our soup has come to a boil. We're going to let it boil for 5 minutes, and I'm going to taste it because let me explain that salt can be problematic. You can add a teaspoonful of salt to a quart, but I'm going to add the salt now because you may have salt in your broth. There may be a salty taste from the sausage. We want to get the salt right before we put it in the jars. So I'm going to give it a little taste. So if you remember, I only used 1 tablespoonful of salt in this whole pot, but that is plenty. If I had put a teaspoonful of salt in each jar, it would have been too much. So in this instance, I wanted to taste it and get the salt right before we can it. Now, if you'll remember, I warned you I was going to talk a lot, so now I'm going to talk a lot. And what I want to talk about is lids and rings and closures for your safe canning. This is a Tattler lid. This is a reusable canning system. It's a plastic lid with a gasket that fits together, and you use your regular ball or golden harvest rings. They work that way. This is a canning system that has been tested and found safe to use, but only if you use it as it was designed to be used. This is a complete canning lid system. Now, this is probably what you're more familiar with. A regular metal lid. This particular one is made by Ball. It fits right into the ring. The gasket is made into it. This is for one use. This is not to be reused for canning. I know there is a lid shortage and some folks are having trouble finding lids, but that doesn't change the fact that these lids are made to be used one time for canning, and these lids, which are a completely separate system, are made to be used over and over again. They are not mix and match. Use them as they were intended. So now we're ready to can. I have my gaskets that go with the Tattler lids in warm water. I have a little bowl of vinegar, and I've dropped the plastic lids in the vinegar. You don't have to do any preparation for the ball lid. Now, because we want only half a jar of solids in our soup, I have figured the easiest way to do this is to take a pint container, which is 2 cups, and measure my solids into a pint container first. And I made a little mistake here. I didn't use a slotted spoon, so I've got too much liquid in here. I'm going to dump that back and start over using a slotted spoon, so I only get solids in my little pint measurer. My jars are in hot water in a big pot in my sink, and I'll take them out one at a time. I always recommend that you do 1 jar at a time, putting hot food into a hot jar, into a hot canner, about 140 degrees. That's to avoid thermal shock and to avoid a broken jar. So I'm going to do a couple of jars fully and into the canner just to illustrate. What I'm doing now is measuring out 2 cups of the solids, and I'll take my jar lifter, empty out one of my jars, and set it on my very crowded counter with a funnel, and I'll start filling the jar. Start with the solid, all measured out, and then I will scoop in the liquid. Sorry about that. Scoop in the liquid up to 1 inch Headspace. Now, I told you earlier that I ended up having not enough liquid in this mixture, so I just added, when I realized that I wasn't going to have enough, I just added broth directly into the pot. So one of the things about this recipe is that since you can only have half a jar of solids, you have an awful lot of liquid, probably more liquid than you would normally have if you were just cooking a soup. And that's okay with me for this soup because this is a very rich broth that we have here. But let me urge you to think about this recipe for a soup starter. And if you want to, when you open it, you can add some potatoes, you can add some rice, anything you like. Now, I am cleaning the rim of the jar with this paper towel that's dipped in the vinegar. This is to get away any food debris or potentially some fat. I'm going to use a Tattler lid on this one. So I take out one of the gaskets, and I take one lid and I fit them together. Now remember, the gaskets are in hot water, simmering, not boiling, and I have the lids down in some vinegar, which will just cut any oil from your fingers or whatever. And I fit them together, and they should fit so that you don't see, when you look down on it, you don't see the gasket sticking out from the lid. Then I'm going to take a ring, and this is just a regular ball ring. I'm going to test to make sure there are no chips in the jar top. Fit that down. Then I'm going to take this ring, and you want to make sure your rings are perfect, not out of round at all. And I clean the inside with a paper towel dipped in vinegar. And even if you've washed it, you've scrubbed it, and it's clean, you're always going to find a little bit of something in there. It might be just a touch of rust. Put my finger on the lid. Now, if you'll watch, I spin the ring backwards so it seats itself naturally. It'll just pop down. If it doesn't seat itself naturally, it's out of round. Then I turned the lid just until it's finger tight, and I'm going to put it right in the canner. I'll do another one of these with a Tattler lid in just a minute, and I'll spend a little bit more time explaining the finger tight. So next I'm going to do the jar using the regular 2-piece ball system. And I've filled my liquid up to a 1-inch Headspace here. And I'm going to clean it off with a little vinegar. Now you saw me rinse the sausage to get rid of the fat, but I'm going to tell you, when you're canning meat, you'll never get rid of all the fat. It's the very nature of meat. So be sure you clean the rims of your jars really well. Now I'm going to take just a second to illustrate, to show you a 1-inch Headspace, and I'm going to actually use a tape measure, and if you'll see, 1 inch from the rim to where the liquid goes is 1-inch Headspace. Headspace is important. You always want to use the USDA recommended Headspace for whatever you're canning, no matter what lid system you're using. So I'm going to reach over here and get the wide mouth ring. I just want to emphasize something to you. Folks that are with jars that do not seal properly, whether you're using regular metal lids or Tattler lids, almost always the problem is your ring. I mean, we end up with just dozens of these things. I'm wiping my lid with vinegar, by the way. And they're all over the place, and they get out of round, and then we use them, and we don't notice that they're out of round, and then something doesn't seal, and we blame all other things, but it's the ring. And that's why you see me always wipe the inside of a ring with just a tiny little bit of vinegar, and then you see me turn a ring backwards to see if it will fall down without being forced. And I'm having some trouble with this one. If you turn it backwards, when it hits the right place, if it's in round, it'll fall down. And it did fall down. Know it? So, and I didn't plan this, by the way. I'm going to get another ring. Okay, I'll wipe this out with vinegar. Watch the difference. Turn it backwards, and it will fall and seat itself. Do I have another bad ring? Well, my goodness, that's a second bad ring. We're going to try this again. So this is a third ring. Put it down and turn it backwards. It went right down. Finger tight, meaning just with your fingers. And it appears that that one worked. We'll put that over in the canner. I'm going to do just one more with a Tattler lid, just to make sure I show you finger tight on that. Okay, so the jar is filled. I'm going to check the headspace on this just for you. And you know, you guys didn't see me debubble these jars. I actually did debubble these jars. See, we've got 1 inch there. Even though with this loose pack, it doesn't appear that you will need to debubble, I did stick my chopsticks down in there and stir it around a little bit. Trying to cut as much for time as possible, and I always end up not getting something on film. So cleaning the rim with the vinegar, whoops, see, I did. Cleaning the rim with the vinegar to make sure it's clean. And this is a Tattler lid. Now, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. I do occasionally have a seal failure when using Tattlers. I very, very occasionally have a seal failure with a regular metal lid. Tattlers are just a tiny bit more finicky. I promise I didn't plan this, but you see this green lid? I'm going to show you a little close-up of this green lid. See that little wrinkle there in the gasket? These gaskets are pretty firm. I don't mean they're hard, but they're pretty firm. And when they get a dent in them like that, don't you throw them away. I have no idea how many times I have used this gasket, but I've really never lost one unless I accidentally cut it. I was busy making the film. I did not catch this. I used this gasket and the seal failed. So moving forward, going west, I'm going to go ahead and show you again. I'm going to illustrate finger tight. I've got my ring here. I'm going to clean the inside of it out with a little bit of vinegar. I always do, just to get any residue from my fingertips, maybe a little spot of rust. But just wipe it out with a little vinegar. Takes just a few seconds. Drop it on. Turn it backwards. Make sure it falls down and seats itself. This one too. Now there we go. It seated itself. So turn it just with your fingers until the jar moves. And then just with your fingers, just not even 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/8 of an inch more, and then put it in your canner. So you'll see that green lid back there. I swear to you, I did not plan this. So I'm going to go through the actual canning process very quickly because this is turning into a long video. There's 3 quarts of warm water in here. You'll see where the water comes to jars. My canner says 3 quarts. USDA says 2 to 3 inches. That isn't much different. I have never run a canner dry. Putting the lid on. It up. This is an All-American. Your Presto or Miro or Granite Ware may close a little bit different. I can only show you how mine closes. You line it up. You lift these little things. I don't know what you call these little things. You lift them. They're lugs. And make sure that they're all 6 up. And then you tighten them on opposite sides so that you get an even fit. This canner, by the way, does not have a gasket. You just put some oil around the inside. I do maybe twice a year, oil the inside. As long as you tighten it down evenly, it's not ever going to get. So tighten that down. When I started this process, I turned my heat up. I was holding the canner at a low heat. I've got everything in it. I'm putting the lid on. I turned it to the highest heat possible. Then I'll be back. I'm never sure if you can see the steam coming out, but the steam is coming out. Yeah, you can see it pretty briskly. Set your timer for 10 minutes and wait. 10 minutes have elapsed. I am under 1,000 feet elevation, 10-pound weight. I'm going to drop it on now and wait. So I'm going to let you hear this now. It's just rattling right away. It's rattling way too much. As soon as it starts that rattle, I'm going to turn my heat down to what I know is my sweet spot. The sweet spot is the lowest possible heat that will maintain your pressure. As soon as this starts rattling, I'm going to set my timer for 75 minutes. I'm going to listen closely. The jiggler will slow down to the point where you get just a little burst, maybe twice a minute, maybe 3 times a minute. That's the sweet spot. Okay, we're going to watch it just a minute. And if you see, it is not jiggling. It's just floating on top of the, I guess you'd call it, this. It's just floating on top of the steam. Every once in a while, 2 or 3 times a minute, it'll give a little jiggle. I have my stove set where I know it works, which is just past the 3.5 mark out of 9. So my stove dial goes 1 to 9. 3.5 is my sweet spot. You can see also the gauge is sitting steady at 11 pounds. So I know that what I've got going on here is using the least amount of water possible to maintain the proper pressure and the lowest possible heat setting. We'll be back. Well, the timer has gone off. It's been 75 minutes. We turn the heat off and we're going to wait for the pressure to go to 0. The pressure is down to 0. That took about 25 minutes. All Americans have a little tick. They sometimes have just a little residual pressure. I'm going to just touch this with a pot holder. You may hear just a tiny little hiss. But you want to make sure all that residual steam is out. Don't do this until your pressure is at 0. Then remove your weighted gauge. Set your timer. Wait 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, we can remove the lid. Open it carefully. When you take it off, be sure you turn it away from your face, because there's still a lot of steam in there. And when we get that lid off, I'll set it aside and wait another 10 minutes. Why all these waits, you may ask? To prevent siphoning and thermal shock. Just wait. You've worked hard. Another 10 minutes won't matter. So now, after waiting all the appropriate 10-minute times, we can take our jars out. They're still really hot and they're still bubbling, so you want to be really careful, not bump your jars. I always put them on this old thick silicone cutting board just so I don't bump it against anything metal. When using Tattler lids, when you take your jars out, there's an extra step. Using protection for your hands, we're going to return that ring to finger tight. Sometimes it doesn't turn at all. Sometimes it turns just a tiny bit. I'm not cranking them down hard because the seal has already started. I don't want to break that. I just want to return the ring to finger tight, hold the lids in place. People will debate this ad nauseum. I'm just showing you what works for me. I am just very carefully checking to make sure the ring is secure, and if it is not, I tighten it just a little. I just snug it up a little. So I let them sit undisturbed for 12 hours 12 to 24 hours. And I'm going to show you this lid that failed. No matter what lid system I'm using, if I have a failure, I examine, and you see where that rough spot, that loose spot was. There's a little fat that's caught under that, and that's why the lid failed. Lesson learned. See that little bit of fat that's caught there? If the gasket had been firm, that wouldn't have happened. So yes, I can have a seal failure, you can have a seal failure, but there's always a reason. The rest of these are sealed. I can lift them up by the lid. That one is going in the fridge. It'll be dinner tonight. Now I'll wash and label these jars, put them away without the rings. You take the rings off before storage. And I'll have 6 jars of goodness on this shelf for later. And you should know that by the time I filmed this closing, I had already eaten the 1 jar, and it was so good. That little bit of chili powder, just set it off. I hope you'd like this recipe. I hope you try it. I hope you get over being afraid of your pressure canner if you are. I do plan at least one more soup recipe by this National Center for Home Food Preservation recipe. And I hope you join us again tomorrow on Debbie's Back Porch.